Good afternoon, everyone. We have now with us Dr. Ullas Karanth, one of the leading wildlife conservation scientists globally. Dr. Karanth is known for pioneering the scientific use of camera traps in population density studies of large wild mammals in India. He has won many international awards, including J. Paul Getty Award for Conservation Leadership and Padma Shri. Currently, he is the Emeritus Director of Center for Wildlife Studies, an organization he founded in 1984. He is also an adjunct professor in the universities of Florida and Minnesota, United States.
I'll basically talk about my experiences of engagement with conservation that goes back to my childhood almost. I'm 76, so that's a long time ago. So I will cover a bit of the issues, then talk about my experience on this particular topic, which I have engaged with for nearly 50 years in conservation and 40 plus years in research. So Malenad is a stretch of land that the Western Ghats of Karnataka and a little bit of the Eastern Ghats, the Biligiri Rangans and the Kaveri Hills. So this whole area I have called Malenad in this. Not many know that it's one of the largest wild tiger populations in the whole world. So I will tell you what I saw but I want to make a couple of definitions clear before I begin, because the very term wildlife is become very confused in the public mind. So wildlife means terrestrial free-ranging vertebrates. That means animals with backbone that are terrestrial, that live on the land or in inland streams, and free-ranging, that is, they are wild, they are not kept in captivity or fed. And a lot of people mistake domestic animals, call it wildlife, or some tiger in a zoo. It's a wildlife species, but it's not wildlife. The term technically wildlife is used in this sense. And what is conservation? That's another more confusing term, because a lot of people mistake it only for preservation, that is, protecting what was there naturally. That is the central element, particularly when you talk about endangered species. But conservation, in its broader definition, includes also damage mitigation from wildlife to human interest, because in the end, human beings have to be engaged in conservation. So if you don't address that, which might mean eradication of harmful species, whether it could be an exotic invading species or a man-eating tiger, that also comes under the definition of conservation. Then there is a bit of utilization too, not so much in India, but in fisheries you see this. Everybody uses inland fishes, so although wild species, they are harvested, and more so in the marine domain, which doesn't come under the term wildlife. But if you go to Latin America, Africa, this consumptive use of wildlife itself is a major driver of conservation. And US, the funding for conservation comes from consumptive use of wildlife. So I'm using these broad definition of wildlife conservation. And what is not wildlife conservation? There's an important topic. This is rights of individual animals, cruelty to animals, all these. I'm not saying it's not important, but it is not a domain of wildlife conservation. Wildlife conservationists don't look at individual animals. They look at populations, because it's impossible to practice whatever I have talked about if you start looking at it at the individual animal level, unless you are studying a very rare species in which half a dozen are left. And domesticated species are not wildlife. 10,000 years ago, we started domesticating plants and animals approximately, and there are about 30 or 40 or 50 species that we have domesticated. Commonest being dogs and cats, but there are camels, there are other species that are also domesticated and used. So this is not wildlife. If it's reared by people or kept in captivity and fed artificially, it's not wildlife. So, and animals in captive situations, in safaris, like the huge giant zoo of sorts in Ahmedabad, in Gujarat recently, that's not wildlife conservation. It may be something else, but it's certainly not wildlife conservation. So, having said that, what is wildlife conservation? First, let's look at biodiversity. This is general. if you look at biodiversity, India occupies only 2% of the Earth's land surface. But we have 13% of the world's bird species, 7% of the mammal species in the world. And within mammals, despite our substantial vegetarian population, 25% of the world's carnivores are found in India. It's an incredible diversity. And this wildlife diversity had nothing to do with us. We didn't create it. Unlike our art and sculpture and music and whatever we are proud of, this is not what we created. This happened because of movement of continental plates and change of climate over geologic times and further speciation that occurred closer within the current Pleistocene era. So as a consequence of all these wonders of nature, we have fauna, typical species represented there that evolved in Asia and are found in India. The wild dog, Asiatic wild dog or dhole, one-horned rhinoceros, the tiger, they are typically Asian species. But we also have African elements in our fauna. The striped hyena, the leopard, the lion, they evolved in Africa and then came over to colonize the Indian subcontinent. We also have species that are typical of North America and Europe and Northern Asia, like the grizzly bear or brown bear. We find it in Kashmir. We have the red fox, the mammal with the largest distribution in the world, which is again a temperate species. We have the elk or the red deer, we call it hangul in Kashmir. So this incredible diversity was given to us when we came across from Africa 70,000 years ago. So I strongly believe we have a responsibility to protect it. We are latecomers to all this. So the ethics that drives me is not kindness to individual animals, it is the rights of all these other species to exist. And that's a far more complicated task, intellectually as well as in practice. So conservation has to happen in situ, that is in the wilderness. So the linkage between animals, habitat, energy flows, all this has to be preserved together. It's, people talk about cloning mammoths and all sorts of things. That can be done, but that's not, you are not recreating the whole functioning system with that. We are increasingly realizing that our own survival in terms of protection of our water resources, soil resources, etc., it's now important to have some proportion of the land under natural conditions. So that has now become conservation of nature in this broad definition has become fundamental to national missions of many countries, regardless of whether they are communist countries or autarkies or whether they are driven by religious regimes or democracies. Almost everybody has signed off on this deal now, although the degree with which they practice varies. And this, again, there is pollination. For example, look at the issue of pollination of trees, dispersal of seeds. So all these things link animals to wildlife. So you just having a forest but devoid of animals is not natural either. In the long run, it has no survival. It will become very different. It will survive as a forest, but it's not a substitute for this full set of species playing their natural roles. So when you talk about saving, bringing back big cats or any other wildlife species, all these elements have to come in. So if we look at our forest cover, roughly in India, that deep green is the forest cover. That's how it must have looked before human beings arrived, in the top left. But on the top right, you see how fragmented and how little remains. And this is the landscape I'm going to talk about. This is the Malenad landscape. This is where I have done bulk of my conservation and research. And the interspersion of, this is Kali Tiger Reserve, and all the red dot represent presence of human settlements. So so there is very little left to protect because we have managed to go everywhere. So we are roughly the 1/3 the size of US in our physical size, the land area. We have 4 times as many people. And these figures may be slightly outdated. Roughly half the people are really poor, and the poor half also is living completely off the land, depending on biomass, depending on farming, livestock raising. So it's a very, very different kind of dependency, which has its own severe consequences for wildlife. And on top of it, we have now a modern economy that's growing very fast. As a consequence of all these both pressures, basically the forests, somewhat natural forests, cover only about 10% of India now. Legally, it's about 15 or 16, but a lot of that what has some semblance to a forest is about 10%, and the areas earmarked for wildlife conservation is only 4%. So when people argue with me saying that, oh, how this is a luxury, we are not a rich country, we can't afford, my counter argument is if you cannot solve a problem by finishing off 96%, can you solve it by finishing off the remaining 4%? So to me, situation like India, China, some of these countries, the battle is really at the edge. So there's not much room for negotiation, although we would like to do that. So what have been the drivers of this change? These were natural systems where animals and plants occupied very, very vast extents. Every paddy field you see in Malenad, the original landscape is this Hadlu, what we call the wet grasslands, wet savannas populated by elephants. But to see these patches now, you have to go into some of the protected areas. Everywhere else, what you see naturally, not the irrigated fields I'm talking about, what you see in Malenad, the irrigated paddy is all this type of habitat. It's gone. So the big thrust, why it's gone, is agriculture, farming. When we became independent to now, our net sown area, cultivated area, has increased by 50%. The forest area was roughly a third of the country in the late 19th century. It's about 10%, as I said now. So this drastic change of land use, the main driver has been agriculture, because there is a tendency in this polarized time to say industry is destroying forests and we're all good people. No, it's not true. We are all dependent on agriculture. We eat the food. So agriculture has been the biggest driver. The other pressure has been livestock. India has 2.82% of world's land. We have 18% of the world's livestock. Far more than the land can support naturally. Our livestock densities are incredible. A wild species like gaur will reach a density of 5 or 10 per square kilometer in the best of forest. It's equivalent, the domestic cattle, we are packing them at 80, 90 per square kilometers. So all this has ecological consequences. So this has been another major pressure. Fuel wood, although it's declining now, when I grew up in the 50s and 40s, fuel wood was the major source of cooking energy. It is still true if you go to Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, some of the underdeveloped parts of the country, this is still the picture you see, whole forests being carried on forests. Then there is the market-linked exploitation. So markets have reached everywhere, and it's not new. It's been 200-year-old, 300-year-old maritime trade. So markets have always been there, and they have a way of reaching places for resources. So the forest exploitation of India was very market-driven till the 1970s and 80s when conservation laws were brought in. And even minor forest products are now linked to global markets. For example, this is a Garcinia that is used in Uttar Kannada and others for making curries, but it's now used in an obesity reduction drug. So market has really blown, and there are many, many products. So if you ever see, somebody selling all these products and say forest essentials or call themselves some fancy label and say this is a good way we are saving nature. No, you are extracting more from nature. We have to be very clear about the energy equations. Associated with livestock and grazing and freedom of movement in the forests and various reasons, people use fire. People burn the forests, and that's another consequence of intense fires, natural fires or even man-made fires at infrequent frequencies had a role in maintaining grasslands, but the frequencies at which they are burning now is just too much. Then in the modern India, to feed our people, we have built dams, and the dams have submerged substantial areas, and people who have come to build the dams have stayed on and cultivated the land, so the dams have taken a bit of the forest. Then as we industrialize, mining has been another pressure. But in terms of total land, all these are very minor. It's like 6 or 8%. It is still, agriculture is at 50%. But still, these have their own consequences. The biggest pressure on eliminating animals still is hunting. The picture is different now, but even now, if you go to Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh, all these areas which are the most extensively forested in India, the forests are there, the animals are gone. Everything bigger than a bread box has been consumed or is being consumed. So, this hunting for protein is a major driver of extinctions of animals in the past, all across India, and it persists quite a bit outside a few protected areas. Then we had the elite hunting, which was particularly after the arrival of gunpowder and firearms. It became a prestigious thing to hunt animals, and the elites, both the British and our royalty. Not many people know that the Maharaja of Mysore had killed about 100 tigers, and there's one Maharaja who's killed over 1,000. So it's not the Brits, we did it too. And after independence, the time I was growing up, this kind of hunting came of urban people with jeeps and battery torchlights. All these came after World War II. So every new technology increased the power of these kind of hunting. So this was the world I saw when I was growing up. In the 50s, 40s, but I was lucky to be born in Bangalore, an area which has a deep tradition of animistic religions, like the entire Bhuta worship. A lot of the Bhutas are gaur, tiger, leopard. So there is that animistic tradition, and one part of it is the Hulivesha, this tiger dance, which used to be spectacular. Now, of course, it's corrupted a bit. But what this shows is this connection to people and culture that tigers and big cats have is very, very deep. This tiger dance is during Dasara, and this is a Huliappa temple in Uttara Kannada district, stone idol of a tiger, and this is Gond thing. So, in this world that I grew up in, today everybody almost in the upper classes assumes that you can go to Kabini, you can go to Nagarhole, spend 3-4 days, you may see a tiger. There's a good chance. And if you go to places like Kana or Bandhavgarh or Ranthambore, you will almost 100% see a tiger. But this was not the case. Tigers were extremely rare, and when I was growing up in Puttur, the only tigers I saw were the dead ones that the hunters bought and paraded in the town. Tigers were almost on the verge of extinction in the 50s and 60s. And when I got hold of a motorcycle in 1967, first thing I did was to go to every wild place possible. Nagarhole, I climbed Kudramukh in 1964 to see tigers. All I saw was tracks. Very rare, they were almost on the brink of extinction. So globally, in the late 60s, this was recognized, and international conservationists were the first to raise voice, saying wildlife is in trouble, but it was symbolized by the fuss kicked up by international conservationists about the tiger going almost extinct. 2010, some of my colleagues and I assembled the data on tiger distributions, and this map documents what I saw is, see, these yellows and browns are where the tigers are. At one time, tigers were distributed across 30 different countries, present-day countries, from Iraq to Vladivostok, from Armenia to end of Bali. That was the distribution. Today, they have shrunk to about 10 countries, and the range of tiger has collapsed to 7% of what it was 200 years ago. So much of this push has come in the last 200 years. As a consequence of this drastic status, IUCN and leading conservationists like George Schaller, Lee Talbot, all these guys made a big noise that the tiger is going to go extinct. And they suggested, there are many ways of doing conservation, but one of the most effective one is concentrate on a charismatic species that has cultural connections, which requires large tracts of land, which is at the top of the food pyramid. So you get to save a lot else on this. It's not about saving tigers or leopards, it's about saving everything else in that piece. But using these iconic species gives you the social handles to get people interested. So luckily for us, at that time, whatever her political liabilities are, Mrs. Gandhi was in power starting from the 60s, and she had an intense interest in wildlife conservation. It came from her father, I don't know how she got it, but she also had tremendous political clout. Every state and center was ruled by her, and she was ruthless. So she went about enacting two of the most drastic conservation laws, the Wildlife Conservation Act in 1972, and later in her regime, the Forest Conservation Act in 1980. And the British already had the Indian Forest Act, but that was also strengthened by her. And she was very pragmatic. She didn't go about it emotionally. She told the chief ministers, implement Project Tiger. She ordered them. But for example, in Karnataka, 60% of the government revenue was from forest. So they said, what do we do for, if we can declare Bandipur as a tiger reserve, we lose 10 crores, 15 crores, which was big money. She said, I'll compensate you in the planning commission allocations for what you lost in revenue. It was a very pragmatic but tough approach. We also had another machinery that we didn't have in any other country in Asia. We had the forest department organized by the Brits in the 19th century. People cursed them, but they did two good things. One, they carved out roughly 30% of India and said this is off limits for agriculture. They allowed other users, but at least the land base for conservation was preserved. And they created the forest departments where to protect timber and land, there was an enforcement capacity. Because in the 70s, similar laws were introduced in across Asia, in other places, but they didn't have teeth. Only in Nepal, where the Maharaja deployed his army, they did this with the army. But otherwise, everywhere else the wildlife vanished. Indonesia, which was a Dutch colony, even Malaysia, which was a British colony, nowhere did they have this mechanism. So the foresters of the first generation, those who were sort of like my elder brothers, they were all 10 years, 15 years older than me. They were the people, the rangers, the guards who really brought back wildlife with the sanction of power that Indira Gandhi enabled. So this is the condition in which I grew up in this Malenad landscape, which is truly spectacular. I'm looking at the prey species of tigers. This is the muntjac, cheetal, sambar, wild pig, gaur, and even elephants. Tigers prey on elephant calves up to 1 ton in weight. So its original fauna is very rich. The attempt is to bring them back. And with this effort, and the three major predators are tiger, leopard, and the Asiatic wild dog or dhole. So the attempt was to protect and bring back these things. And in Karnataka, it was particularly effective because we had a very, very capable forest minister. We had a good chief minister, Devaraj, but he hated his forest minister, who was next to him in political muscle. So he gave him this useless department. But that man, K.H. Patil from Gadag, the present H.K. Patil's father, was an incredible person. He assessed the situation very quickly and he implemented all those laws. He got the best officers posted. He himself visited forests. He cancelled all the populist things like you could take a bullock cart and bring as much firewood as possible by paying 5 rupees. He cancelled everything. And he stood by it regardless of the pressure from the Malenad MLAs, who are the least concerned about conservation. They first go say, give us permission for this and that mining. So he stood up to them. And because of him, the Wildlife Act was particularly effective in Karnataka. So I had seen all this in a dismal condition, but by 1986, I had switched my careers. I worked in Myco for a couple of years, then I sold tractors for a few years, then I bought a farm and farmed for 8 years. But all through, I equipped myself studying about wildlife, and I managed to finally, find mentors who inspired me to do this. And one of the things is, how do you research tigers? They are large predators. And the research was first time done by Dr. George Schaller, who is in this picture. He went to Kana and did the first tiger study in 1962-63. And I was a second year student in engineering. When I read in 1965, I said, I hate this engineering and I want to do this. So I was very clear from that day, I didn't want to be an engineer, but it took me 10 years to make that transition. I eventually ended up as a PhD student of Dr. Melvin Sundquist, who was the first person to radio collar tigers in Chitwan, Nepal in the 70s. And of course, I had friends in the forest department, my late friend Mr. Chinnappa, who taught me all the field craft. And I had these tribal trackers who were incredibly skilled at this. So I tried to blend modern science with ancient fieldcraft. It's not modern science or ancient things. Some good stuff is there, you absorb it into modern science. That was my approach. So I started looking at the tiger, and this is the primary thing is it's a predator on tigers and leopards are both predators on large prey animals. So I was thinking of doing a radio telemetry study, putting radio collars on. Radio collars had just come in 1967. They were invented and used on wildlife in the late 60s in US, and Mel Sundquist was one of the first radio trackers in America. So we had developed this technique for catching tigers, which was adapted from a Nepalese tiger hunting technique. So you tie up a buffalo bait and the tiger comes and takes the bait, and while the tiger is at the bait, you quietly go and sneak and put a big cloth fence around it, a few hundred meters from it in a triangular shape. And then I would get on a tree, we leave a little gap for it to come, and the whole team would get on, except me, I would be on a tree, rest of the people will be on elephants, and they'll push the tiger off the kill. What it does is, it tries to find a way out, but this white cloth is a psychological barrier. A tiger can easily jump over it, but it just doesn't want to do it, and it's funny to see them bouncing off and then used to come right under me at this. All I had was a little aluminum dart gun. If the tiger did something to me, I was finished, but nothing happened. I'm here. So it didn't work with leopards because they hunt monkeys, they keep looking up and come, and they would spot me and jump the cloth and go away. I could never catch a leopard using this method. So we caught 4 tigers and 3 leopards, and I tracked them for varying periods. I had a lot of resistance. There was a minister who deprived me of my permit. I had to go to High Court, and Mr. Uday Holla, then a rising lawyer, argued my case, and I got my permit. He argued for free also. So, but it's interesting. What telemetry tells you is you are able to enter the world of the tiger. I would be in the forest most of the days. My wife Pratibha is here, so I would see her only once a week if she was lucky or unlucky. So the tigers have a communication system. Area of greater Bangalore will have 10 tigers or 15. How do they even communicate? They don't have email, they don't have WhatsApp, they have nothing. How do they even know? They have a very sophisticated scent communication system. They spray scent, leopards do the same. Your domestic cat does the same. And these are cards, calling cards. They tell who was there individually, when, how long ago. And depending on that, you react. If somebody is intruding your territory, you chase and drive him out. If it's a mother cub following the mother, you follow it. If female is in estrus, the male will try to find her. So this communication system is extraordinarily sophisticated. So I was able to also watch a lot of tiger behavior once they got used to my vehicle, not me. If I got off the vehicle, they'll run. But if I stayed in my vehicle, they got used to my car, and I could watch a lot of natural behavior. And the social system that they have is the females have territories in which there is sufficient prey and they can raise their cubs, and they defend these. They get these territories at about 3 or 4 years age from their mother typically, but they defend it from other tigresses. And there are males in the population. Some of them have mating rights over 2 or 3 female territories. They also fight among themselves to get as many of these as possible. These females hold on for about 8 years. Then somebody else comes and kills them or kicks them out. With the males, the turnover is much faster, 3.5 years. So all this elaborating social system I was beginning to understand, and it also explained a lot of things about tiger biology. For example, that red spot in the middle is the territory of a female, and the 2 darker green spots are territories of, anyway, the smallest deep green is 20 square kilometer territory of a female. Male territory was about 40 to 50 square kilometers, and the wandering males who didn't have mating rights, who floated around looking for opportunities had ranges of 100 square kilometers. By then, my colleagues in Russia had started radiotelemetry studies also, Dale Mikkel near Vladivostok in the last of the Russian tigers. And he was finding female territories of 600 square kilometers. Here it's 20, there it's 60. This explains why there is such variation in tiger habitats and how that drives. That drove my curiosity. Why is it that the same animal which has identical, why does it need more space and such lower densities in those areas? So, and the theoretical explanation was the tiger eats one deer-sized animal roughly every week. So they are taking about 50 deer in a year to last 1 year. But to produce 50 deers in a year, you need a capital of 500 deer. It's like they're taking the interest income, not the capital itself. So to support a single tiger, you need 500 prey animals. And this is an iron law of tiger conservation. You can't break it. So I of course did a lot of this kind of stuff, looking at kills and picking up their poop and all that stuff. And it quickly became clear that the prey really held the key. More prey you had, more tigers you could have. Even if you didn't know how many tigers are there, but just by counting prey, you could say how many tigers can be here. You can answer that question. It's a very, so we started, one of the things I have always loved is, thanks to my engineering education, I was not afraid of numbers. So when I went to the US wildlife biology program, the field was becoming very quantitative, very statistical, and many younger people than me were finding it hard, but because of my engineering background, that was really helpful. So I dug deep into wildlife statistics. How do you count animals? And one of the methods that was proven and very good was to count these prey species. We call it line transect sampling. You walk in a line, you not only count animals, you also measure the distance, because using the distance, then you can estimate what proportion of animals you have missed. It's a very important issue in wildlife counting. Is unlike a lab scientist who can see every rat in his lab, we see only partially what is out there, and estimating that missing fraction is really the key to modeling. The modeling is very complex, I'm not going to talk about it, but this line transect sampling gave the first ever estimates of animal densities in Asian forest, derived using rigorous methods, and a lot of preparation is required, a lot of hard work, training, all that is there. And I recruited a lot of staff, but I also had many young people from Bangalore interested in wildlife who volunteered, and I trained them. They're all in their 40s and 50s now. So this kind of data, it opened my eyes, because the impression in the ecology was tropical forests of tropical areas of Africa have a lot of wildlife, and tropical forests of India and South America, we don't have a lot of big animals. But this showed actually that Africa, we had densities and biomass of big animals comparable to East African savannas in places like Nagarhole and Bandipur and Kana. So this was the first breakthrough data. Around this time, I was happily studying tiger behavior. The Chinese economic reforms kicked in, and by 90s there were large middle class, upper class in China that was, their medical system is completely dependent on animal-based medicines, and rarer the animal, rhino, tigers, they have much more value, they give you much more power, whatever, superstitious, but it drove the extinction of tigers around that time in Southeast Asia. The Chinese traders in Hong Kong connected with the local village hunters and middlemen, and they sucked out all the tigers, and this wave hit India in the 1890. Even in Ranthambore, where my friend Valmik Thapar was literally living with tigers, tigers vanished before his eyes. So this was a different crisis. Understanding tiger behavior no more became my priority. So what do? This is driven by, but we had a system of monitoring numbers. See, the key is you have to know how many there are, and you have to monitor the population, if you have to address problems if you have. But we had an antiquated method developed by a senior forest officer in Orissa, using these tracks, pug marks, what they call the pug mark census. It had absolutely no scientific basis, but because of the hierarchical system in the forest department, it became a religion. So from 1968-70, they had pug mark counts, and of course, once you give statistics to government officials, it can only go up, it will never come down. So on paper, by the time the crisis hit, we had lots of tigers, but many parks were emptied of tigers. So I was very harshly critical of all this approach, and I was much junior to these senior honchos in the forest department, and they didn't like it. But I kept saying, but then I said, I also have a responsibility. Or how do you actually count them? Again, technology changes. Around that time, a guy called Bill Goodson in Lenexa, Kansas, had developed these cheap automated cameras had come. He had developed a tripping device, electronic tripping device, which the hunters in America were using. They would keep these cameras, check the photographs, and select spots where the biggest antlered bucks would come. It was developed for hunting. I saw it when I was in Florida, and I said, this is what I want for developing a good method for tigers. So I brought a few camera traps. The thing is, the tigers have unique body markings. Their stripe patterns are unique to each individual. It's as distinct as a human fingerprint. So with leopards, zebras, many animals. So I started developing these methods and IDing tigers, giving them individual tigers numbers. And so this whole photographic method, there was also a lot of statistics associated with it. Again, modeling that involves estimating of all the animals, tigers there, how many you have missed. That's called capture recapture. It's a method originally invented by the mathematician Laplace, but then later developed by wildlife statisticians to much more sophisticated levels. So I was using that stats in combination, and we published in good journals. There was a bit of resistance outside India. So I wanted to test it in all habitats. Then Mr. Kamal Nath was Minister Environment. He was a junior minister. So he was very keen on this, and he told the officers, you don't understand what he's doing, please give his permission. So at the end of it, I was able to actually publish a paper in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. We looked at tiger numbers and prey numbers, and the 1 to 500 ratio held very well. So if you want to, there were places where tiger numbers were higher than prey because they were eating cattle. There were other places where the tigers had been poached, there was enough prey, but there were fewer tigers. So these kind of insights would come from this type of research. And I trained a lot of people who, many of them are now in very senior positions in the conservation and research community, academia, etc. So I decided to dig in deeper in Karnataka from 2004 onwards till about 2018, when I stepped out of my job and I sort of retired in a way. So we did a massive long-term monitoring of tigers. We had field stations, we had cameras, jeeps. These are all crude. They're nothing fancy, but a lot of effort and very well-trained people capable of using this equipment sensibly. Now they have 10 times more cameras, but it's not being used properly. So, for example, this data showed that the density of all prey animals, this includes all the 5 species I mentioned, was very high as 50 in Nagarhole. Bandipur was pretty high also, about 40 something. But the newer parks that were protected more recently had much lower density. So it was really, the key was not to take some tiger, dump it somewhere, and then take a goat and feed it and all this nonsense that they do now. It's a 20-year process. You can bring the prey base back, then the tigers, you have established the carrying capacity, that is when you have to bring the tigers you will usually move in. And the density of tigers I got was incredible. It was like, only in Kaziranga we got higher densities. Very high densities in these 2 well-protected parks. And the interesting thing is, you see this going up and down. Minimum from 7 tigers per 100 square kilometers, for example in Nagarhole, to 15 tigers. Why is this fluctuation? Because the number of females breeding every year is not the same. In some years, 1 year later you get the cameras, you get the tigers. So in the previous years, say there are 30 tigresses in Nagarhole, breeding tigresses, 20 may breed 1 year and 10 in the next year. So when the cubs turn up in your camera traps, when they grow up and turn up in your camera traps, that shows the bounce. Now, but if you do your study once in 4 years, you are completely missing the bounds. So, which is what's being done. The official surveys are done once in 4 years. These population, so there's a lot of science that goes into it. It's not just buying tons of cameras and putting them on. Anyway, we had this long-term data set beginning in 2003. There was an initial spell, systematic sampling. We got 996 tigers in Karnataka, Malenad. They were not all at the same time, but capture history of nearly 1,000 tigers in this landscape, in just 3 or 4 parks, which were the only places where they were really abundant. So this data can be analyzed in a different way also. Not only how many there are, how the numbers are changing, but also what is the proportion that survive. This is really critical, because if there's poaching, if there's pressures, that survival drops. Even in the best protected population, naturally, 25% of the tigers are lost every year. So other day you must have seen in Ranthambore, missing tigers. All this is utter nonsense, because 3% of your tigers are lost every year to mortality, dispersal, but they are reproducing. As long as the production replaces, there is no problem. This data clearly showed the Nagarhole population was roughly increasing at 3% per year. It's a low, that's fine, because it's already at a very high level. Whereas if you start protecting from a low base, the statistics. But survival rate estimation, recruitment rate estimation is most important. We did that in our project, but there's been no interest in the government to do any of this. But the entire Thailand government took over a project, and they are monitoring tigers using this framework for the last 10-15 years. We were also able to monitor some dispersal, showing the importance of in-between landscapes. One tiger dispersed from Bhadra to Anshi Dandeli, another one dispersed from Bandipur to near Shikaripur. So they are still able to make these movements through coffee estates, through reserve forest. But it is important for us to make sure we have more tunnels than highways, because those are the things that will break this continuity. Highways and things like that will really rupture this continuity. So we also did a lot of training of forest department staff those days under this project at all levels. And the NTCA at one time, Mr. P.K. Sen at the back, they were very interested, but he didn't last long enough in the system. I was trying to convince them to use these better methods. We even held seminars, getting some of the best people in business to Wildlife Institute. I tried to transfer it, but it's very hard to transfer knowledge to a bureaucracy that already knows everything. It's very hard. At that time, there was acute deficit of wireless sets, vehicles. This I'm talking of the 1998, late 90s. And we donated jeeps, boats, and tried to beef up the protection also. And the biggest problem we encountered are people living inside this. I showed you the first slide. People are practicing agriculture, livestock husbandry, or logging with the forest department. And in Nagarhole, we had these people come to us and say, we can't live here anymore, animal damage is too much. We want to go somewhere and find some good land. So I hired a journalist called Mr. Muttanna, who had a lot of empathy with people. And we started communicating with the people, religious leaders. It was quite a massive effort, and eventually, over a period of 10 or 15 years, during this period, we were able to convince about 2,200 families to either avail government resettlement projects, the most successful one being in Bhadra, where the entire 500 families moved out. Nagarhole was about 50-60% completed. So people moved out and the forest came back. But you also have to work with them. So there was a follow-up. My daughter Kriti has done a longitudinal study of how they are better off after they moved out. So it was a very integrated project. In Kudremukh, we moved just 5 families, but they had 600 cattle. So once they went, the whole area, you can now see in Bhagavati Nature Camp in Kudremukh, if you go, you see this is the area. The wildlife came back once people, because many pressures were. Livestock was removed, hunting was removed, forest fires went off. Law enforcement became very easy, because if somebody is found inside, he can't say, I'm an ordinary villager collecting Nellikai. You are here because you want to collect something more valuable. And the conflict comes down. The livestock and tigers don't mix well. Elephants and paddy fields don't mix well. So it has many And this is work that my daughter Kriti, who runs now CWS, is carrying on in a bigger way. There's a project called Wild Save, where they make calls and the numbers are recorded. People go there to assess the damage, fill the government forms, and try to get them compensation speedily from the government. So it's an innovative project. The other issue is that tourism. If managed well, the only other people who have interest in having wildlife on the land are wildlife tour operators. Because everybody else wants the land for mining, for microhydral projects, solar projects, something else. Nobody wants tigers and natural. I mean, the other interests are different. People want it for farming. Tourism industry has an interest in having animals on the land. But unfortunately, it is managed in a very corporatized, hotelized, profit-seeking way. So it's all about squeezing as much as you from the tourists without putting anything into the conservation part of it. So once the park is built up and the wildlife recovers, then you suddenly start seeing lodges come up around and all this. The process of bringing back the wildlife, they are nowhere there. But in South Africa and other countries, they have conservancy models where land outside, people change from agriculture or cattle raising to wildlife, so they make more money per acre from the land, in some cases from hunting, in some cases from tourism. In later stages, when it gets really spectacular, just tourism too works. So there are many innovations that can be brought in. The other problem has been with the increasing funding of conservation, particularly of the same reserves, crores and crores being dumped. There's come a lot of unnecessary activity just to spend the funds. And some of it, there is leakage, the system. So this is creating water holes, bringing bulldozers to remove so-called lantana exotics, making elephants out of lantana. All this is clown show. It is not science. It is causing more damage than just leaving nature alone. With minimum management, if you understand what you're doing. It's like a watchmaker's task, not taking a hammer and breaking a watch. So that's kind of where we are. And on top of it, now with the modern economic growth, we have a whole set of challenges. People are voting for economic growth. Our GDP is at highest levels, per capita GDP, one of the highest. And that's not going to get reversed. Because in a democratic society, you can't impose. People do want development. We have highways that are cutting through parks. We have solar farms that are spreading across the land, primarily driven by subsidies and tax holidays. Their footprint is so much larger, hundreds of times larger than, say hydrocarbons or whatever. They're taking over all the bustard habitats in Rajasthan, blackbuck habitats in Rajasthan. Wind power, which is whacking birds and bats. So there's a lot of this new green energy that is touted as a solution, which is actually driving the last nail on the coffin on many of our best wildlife places. And nobody recognizes them as a threat. See, the big dam, at least people protest. This one is green, so let's have more of it. That's the problem. Microhydral projects, again, every riverine little valley, except the protected areas, have now these. They produce electricity when it's not needed. They're all basically tax boondoggles. If you apply the strict market test, these will work only in a few places. I'm not saying they don't work at all. But for the most part, it's a tax holiday-driven boondoggle. So natural landscapes require two things if they are to go forward. We need energy. GDP is connected to energy, and the most efficient green energy is nuclear power. I had a big fight with my father because he was against nuclear power. But a reserve like Kali, or for example, the Kaiga Dam, which has 1200 megawatts, or 1800 now, upscale, that would submerge 5,000 square kilometers if you built a hydro dam. And if you build wind and solar or whatever, it will be even bigger area. Because what is called energy density is a critical element in thermodynamics. If you are an engineer, you have studied thermodynamics, you know the idea of energy density. How much is the footprint of land for producing 1 kilo? Fingernail-sized uranium generate as much energy as 500 tons of coal. Eventually, we have to give up on coal. Right now, the global warming is a problem, but it's not going to be a quick transition. So there's got to be, we should start confounding conservation with going back to the old ways. Going back to the old ways is not possible because we have 8 billion people on earth now. And everybody wants a higher GDP, higher consumption. So if you can reverse back and take the population back to whatever it was, 1 billion and then, everybody goes and lives in a mud hut and lives for 30 years expectancy rather than 70 or 80. It's possible, but it's utopian to say that we can reverse the clock back. There are several ideas in this. One is the idea of decoupling. It's not fully ripe, I don't agree everything with what they say, but we have to meet these needs by decoupling the extractive part. Produce energy, produce agriculture, instead of all our dams will fill up. They all have a life expectancy of 70, 80 years. What are you going to do? So you have to have genetically modified plants that can deal with climate change, deal with the coming water scarcity. There's no other way that you can deal these critical problems. So that's kind of the very broad picture, and at the core of it has to be science. Conservation, emotion is very important. A lot of people, even I jumped into conservation because I was emotionally connected to Huli Vesha, then to real Huli, all that. But emotion has to drive it, but the science has to be the tempering on this passion. Otherwise, the passion goes in wrong directions. I'll end there.